Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Beit Hamikdash Perek Gimel Halacha Beis and onward. The Rambam here discusses the role of the Levi in the Beit Hamikdash, and he goes through the different responsibilities of a Levi. One of the responsibilities is V'yiyu mehen misherin. From the Leviim they would choose those who would sing. L'sherer ala karban b'chol yom, to sing at the time that they would bring the karban, the sacrifices, every day. And then he goes on to say that the Ikar Shira in Halacha Gimel, ve'ein emer Shira ela b'peh, b'lei kele she'ikar hashira shehi avidasa b'peh, that Shira must be done vocal, because the primary avodah of Shira is vocal. There's a machlekes in the Gemara, Masechta Erechin, Masechta Sukkah, whether Ikar Shira b'peh or Ikar Shira b'kli, is the principal Shira vocal or is an instrumental, and the halacha is that it's Ikar Shira b'peh. And what were the instruments needed? Lipsumi kola, to spice up the sound of the song, of the singing. But the Ikar Shira, the avodah, the service of the Beit Hamikdash, is only vocal. And then there were others, he said, who would play instruments. They didn't have to be Leviim. Some were Leviim, some were Yisraelim. And then he goes on to talk about all the different instruments. And then in Halacha Vav, he adds another halacha. B'shnei masa yom b'shana hachala mak lefnei hamizbeach. There were 12 days a year when they would play the flute in front of the mizbeach. And he goes on to list them. The first one is the Shchitas Pesach Rishon, when they slaughtered the Karban Pesach, the first Pesach, because it's Pesach Sheni. And there also, when they would shech the Karban Pesach, the Leviim would play the flute. They would play the flute. And then he says that this flute, Chalul Zeh Deicha Shabbos, it even overrides Shabbos. Mipnei shehu Chalul Shel Karban, because it's a flute that is associated with a Karban. And a flute that's associated with a karban is Aveidahi, it's Aveida B'Deiches Shabbos, and overrides the Shabbos. So the question that is asked by the Lechem Mishnah and Hilchos Lulav is that there seems to be an inherent contradiction here. On one hand, the Rambam says that the Aveida is B'Peh, Ikar Shira B'Peh. The instruments are only supplemental, they're not crucial for the Aveida. And only an Aveida overrides the Shabbos. So how could it be that the Aveida of the Cholil, of the flute, override Shabbos? It's not an Aveda. So the Lechem Mishnah says that Tosfos in Sukkah already asked this question, and Tosfos answers that yes, it's true, that Ikar Shira B'Peh, but playing an instrument is not a biblical prohibition, it's only a shavus, a rabbinical prohibition. And there's a principle in the Gemara, Ein Shvus B'Mikdash, there is no rabbinical restrictions in the Beit Hamikdash. That's a general rule. There are some exceptions to that, but that's the general rule. And the Lechem Mishnah says that answer also reconciles the two rulings of the Rambam. The problem here is, the Aruch LaNer says there's a problem, because according to the Lechem Mishnah, according to Tosfos, the reason why it's override Shabbos is because it's only a shvus, it's only rabbinical. But that's not what the Rambam says. The Rambam says that it's an Aveda, and because it's an Aveda, it overrides the Shabbos. That's one very strong question. Another question, if Ikar Shira B'Peh, if that's true, and that's how the Rambam rules, how could the Rambam even consider playing the flute to be an Aveda? Why is it an Aveda? Ikar Shira B'Peh. There's another question. According to Rashi and Tosfos, the flute only played these 12 days. Because the Gemara asks the question, Maishna Hani, Gemara in Erchin, what is so different about these 12 days? Why are these 12 days designated for playing the flute? And the Gemara answers, because these are days when we complete the whole Hallel. Even an individual davening completes the entire Hallel. Well, the Rambam makes it clear that they did play flutes all year round, not just these 12 days. Whenever they played instruments, the flute was included in the instrumentation. So what's the Gemara's question? Why are these days different? They're not different. So we must understand that the Rambam has a different interpretation of what the Gemara's question is and what is unique about these 12 days. So to answer these questions, I think it's important to analyze, what does that mean, Ikar Shira B'Peh? Does it mean that the Aveda of Shira is exclusively vocal? Exclusively vocal. With the instrument, it's not considered an Aveda. as beautiful as the instruments are, and they enhance the Shira, but they're not an Avodah. They're not considered to be an integral service in the Beit Hamikdash. That's one way of explaining it, but there's another way, perhaps a more accurate way, and it's based on the language of the Gemara, Iker Shira Bepeh. That means the principal form of Shira is Bepeh. What does that mean? That means that everyone agrees, both opinions, whether you say Iker Shira Bepeh or Iker Shira Bekli, they both agree that you could do the Aveda with vocals or with instruments. But Iker Shira Bepeh, that opinion holds that the principal Shira has to be vocals. What's the difference if we follow the first approach or the second approach? The second approach is, let's say for some reason a Levi didn't do the Shira Bepeh, but a Levi did do the Shira Bekli. The Chiyuv of Shira devolves on a Levi, and for some reason there was no Shira Bepeh, there was a Shira Bekli. True, that's not the ideal. L'chatchila, initially you have to do it Shira Bepeh, and even if you didn't do Shira Bekli, it's perfectly all right. It's not the ideal also, but you did the Aveda. But if the Levi didn't do his principal Aveda, at least he can do the Aveda of Shira and fulfill the mitzvah, the obligation of Shira. But if you say that Ika Shira Bepeh, that it's exclusive, only Bepeh, then if the Levi doesn't do the Shira Bepeh, they didn't fulfill the mitzvah of Shira. It's one of the mitzvahs in the Torah, to do the Shira. They didn't fulfill that mitzvah. From the language of the Gemara and from many other sources, one could prove that Shira Bekli, according to the one who says Ika Shira Bepeh, is also an Aveda, is also Shira. And if you say Ika Shira Bekli, he agrees that Shira Bepeh is also Aveda, but initially you have to do Shira Bekli. What happens if the Levi didn't do one? He could always do the other. So when the Rambam says that the Iker Shira, the Aveda is Belevi, that means L'chatchila, it has to be done with the Levi. You can't say, let the Levi do the Kli and let someone else do the Shira. That's not the proper way of doing it. But if that's what happened, then it is an Aveda. That's the introduction. Now, when you talk about the 12 days that they would say Shira, they would say Hallel these 12 days, and they would play the Khalil, the flute. There it was different, because there's a question raised by Rabbi Gaon, and actually he gives the explanation, that there are two levels of Hallel. There's a level of Hallel that's Kriya, you're supposed to read the Hallel, and there's a level of Hallel that's Shira, that's song. In the Sefer Michtevei Torah, from Mordechai Kalina, who was a correspondent together with the Rogachover, he proves that Shechita, the shechting of the Korban Pesach, when they would read the Hallel, that was not Shira, that was Kriya. So that's what the Gemara means when it asks, why are these 12 days different? Not that these 12 days they played the Chalil as opposed to other times. No, they use the Chalil throughout the year. But why are these days different that the Chalil is considered to be an Aveda, because it overrides the Shabbos, because among these 12 days there's definitely going to be a Shabbos. And yet it overrides the Shabbos. So that's the question, not why is these days unique that we play with a Chalil, but these days are unique because they override Shabbos, and there's no other time of the year when playing an instrument overrides Shabbos. So the Gemara answers, because these are days when a Yachid Geimer is a Hallel. That's the Rabbi Gaon's proof that there's a concept of Hallel that's not Shira, but it's the whole Hallel. It's a din of Kriya. You have to read the whole Hallel, the way the whole Hallel is composed, without skipping anything. That's a geder of Kriya. So when they said Hallel on Shchitas HaPesach, and likewise we have to assume all the other 11 days, it was a din of Kriya, no Shira. If there's no Shira Bepeh, then you have to have an instrument play. That becomes the Aveda of Shira. And therefore, it's Deicha Shabbos. And this also answers a very Peladic Taisvus. Taisvus in Tainis says that according to the Manda Omar, Shira, Ika Shira Bepeh, everyone couldn't sing, even Psulim, even Mamzerim. Why? Because it's only vocal, no instruments. But if you say Ika Shira Bekeli, that the principal Shira is with an instrument, you have to have Kainim or Leviim, because the instruments were holy. Very, very puzzling. It's clear from every source that a Levi had to do the Shira B'Peh, according to that opinion, and no one else is allowed to do it. How could a Zar, how could a non-Levi do it? It's a transgression. And some commentaries want to say there's a mistake there in the Tosfos. There's an scribal error. But that's very difficult to assume. And many commentaries do not look at it as a mistake. So based on what we said before, we can give an answer. Yes, it's true that a Levi has to do the Shira B'Peh. And if a Levi does the Shira B'Peh, which is the Aveda, and you don't have a Levi doing the instrumentation, that means you fulfill the Aveda through that Levi. And if that's the way you fulfill the Aveda, no one else is allowed to do it. Not even a Kohen, but certainly not a Yisrael. But what happens if, for whatever reason, the Levi did the instrumentation, played the musical instruments, and he had in mind that I'm doing this as an Aveda? Then anyone could do the Shira, because even though that's not the ideal, again, Ika Shira B'Peh, but if it worked out that the Shira was done with an instrument, then the vocals are no longer needed to be an Aveda. If it's not needed to be an Aveda, it's only to sing, then even a Yisrael, even a Mamzer, even an apostle could do it. So the main point over here is that everyone agrees that either thing, either method, Shira B'Peh, Shira B'Kli, could be an Aveda, even if you hold that Ika Shira B'Peh, as long as you have a Levi doing the Shira B'Peh, that becomes the Aveda, and the Kli doesn't have to be a Levi. It could be a Yisrael also. As long as he's a Meyuchas, he has to have a good ancestry, as the Rambam says. But if, for whatever reason, the Levi didn't do the Shira B'Peh, then you have to have a Levi doing the Shira B'Kli to fulfill the Aveda of Shira.